come to Pueblo at the invitation of the Chicano Indian Alliance down here to stand in solidarity, because we know that Denver and Pueblo, Colorado, are the epicenter for the struggle against this hate speech called Columbus Day. The point is that the struggle continues because we understand that underlying all of this is not about Columbus the man. It's not about a parade. It's about an entire ideology that seeks to oppress and marginalize our people. And so it may start with the parade, it may start with the holiday, but we find it then continues through economic and political policies, through legal decisions, through a lack of enforcement of our treaty rights, natural resource rights, all the way to the United Nations. We see this racism that it's represented in the holiday, because there's no logical explanation why there should be a state or national holiday to Christopher Columbus in the United States. He never came to the United States. He certainly never came to Colorado. And so why do they have a holiday here? It's because it represents something other than Columbus. It represents Columbus as an icon for the oppression of the peoples who were here. The success of Manifest Destiny. For 300 years, there was no celebration of Columbus. Till 1893, there was no national celebration of Columbus. Then at the World's Fair in Chicago, they began to elevate Columbus to national hero status. So 400 years after he got lost and showed up here was the first time that they actually started celebrating him. And why is that? There's a number of explanations, but one of them was articulated by a historian at the World's Fair named Frederick Jackson Turner, who wrote about the close of the frontier. The importance of the frontier in American history was his paper. And he declared the frontier closed in 1893. And what he was saying was that Manifest Destiny had been realized. That Manifest Destiny was that ideology, official ideology of the United States, saying that God had given the white race dominion over North America. And Frederick Jackson Turner in 1893 at that World's Fair celebrating Columbus said that Columbus's vision has really now been realized, that the wilderness is closed, and that the American Indian has been subordinated now, subdued. And it was from that point that the United States said, okay, well, what's this mission then? What's this mission that we're celebrating here at the World's Fair? And how do we continue it? And they did continue it with the Spanish-American War in 1898. And so that vision about Manifest Destiny and the continuing frontier that Frederick Jackson Turner wrote about, and that they used Columbus as the poster boy for, resulted in the U.S. occupation of Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, the overthrow of the monarchy in Hawaii, the occupation of Guam, Samoa, and the Philippines, and then excursions into Central America, into places like Guatemala and Nicaragua. And so we know that this notion of Columbus, it's much more than a man, a historical figure, or a parade, or a holiday. It's about an entire worldview that says that Native people are expendable for the expansion of the progress of Western civilization. That's what that World's Fair was about in 1893. Anybody who studies it, I invite people to study it, because it's a classic case of institutional and structural racism. So when we come to Pueblo, or we go to Denver, or we protest this anywhere else, that's what we're opposing, because it's still alive and well. We see it even in the execution of the war in Iraq or Afghanistan. Look at the vocabulary that they use. They use vocabulary over there in those war theaters. They did it in Vietnam too. Any country that's in any area that's not under the control of the U.S. military, you know what they call it in Afghanistan? They call it Indian country. Indian country. That's a direct line from the Indian Wars. What do they say to their personnel? There are rules against fraternizing with the local people. Why is that? Because they don't want the U.S. Army people to go native. That's the term they use. You're not to go native. That's from the Indian Wars. When somebody in an official position says something that's against policy, They say that person's gone off the reservation. That's a term they use regularly in the execution of the war. You've gone off the reservation. You better get back in line. Well, where does that come from? You know where that comes from? That comes from when the reservations were first created. Indian people had to wear brass rings, brass tags around their neck. And if you left the reservation without your tag, or you left without permission, and you went off the reservation, you were considered a hostile and you could be killed immediately. So that terminology, going off the reservation, going native, Indian country, that's the continuation of a mindset that we're still the enemy in our own homeland. That the Indian wars are not over. They're not over here, and they're not over in other parts of the world. And they're going to treat other people, other brown people, other yellow people, other black people, like Indians. Is that people say, when we ask them, well, what do you think it means that Columbus discovered America? Oh, they say these days, it doesn't mean anything. It just means he was the first European to come to the Americas. Well, I wish it only meant that, but it doesn't. I'm trained in the law. I know what it means in the law. The Doctrine of Discovery is a legal doctrine, and this is what they're celebrating on Columbus Day, the Doctrine of Discovery. And the Doctrine of Discovery is a legal doctrine that was handed down in 1823 by the Supreme Court of the United States that said any civilized Christian European country that finds the lands of other non-Christian peoples has the right to go in and take possession and dominion over that territory.
Whose doctrine is this?
It's the U.S. Supreme Court's doctrine. It's in a case called Johnson versus McIntosh from 1823.
But they specify non-Christian?
Yes, in the opinion.
So no separation of church and
No,
state?
absolutely not. They use scripture and they talk about God in that opinion. And I encourage people to read the opinion. And that's not the only time they do it.
Yeah, our God is better than your God.
And that's not the only, they don't only do it with Indians. They did it in the Dred Scott opinion in 1857, where they said God made the separate races. The curse of Cain made the dark races. And so in 1857, the Supreme Court says, because of that, in part, black people possess no rights that white people must respect. Supreme Court of the United States. And then in 1873, in Bradwell versus Illinois, a case about women, the rights of women, all women, white women, black women, Indian women, they said God ordained that there's a separate sphere for men and women. Myra Bradwell wanted to be a lawyer in Illinois. They said, no, you can't. Because God said, there's this sphere for women, there's this sphere for men, and women can't be lawyers. So the Supreme Court has used scriptural justification for its opinions many, many times. This idea that the law in the United States is secular, that it's not religious, it just blinks reality. But back to the Doctrine of Discovery. That's really the point of our protest against Columbus Day. Because it's Columbus, this notion of discovery, the articulation of the Doctrine of Discovery in Supreme Court law, that has led to the loss of 2 billion acres of our territory in the United States. It's led to the loss of our health, to the loss of our culture, to the loss of our languages, to the loss of everything that is essential to who we are as Native peoples. And that's what we object to. Because that's what Columbus Day celebrates, is that process, that entire process that has moved us to the margin of existence. And they celebrate it because we were in the way. We were in the way of their progress, of their civilization, which we now know is not very civilized. And it's not very progressive when it produces air that we can't breathe, water that we can't drink, food that we can't eat, genetic defects that we can't explain, the elimination of species that are irreplaceable. Is that progress? I don't think so. But that's what they celebrate every Columbus Day. And we're here to say there's a different vision for the future. We're here to provide a different vision for future generations, for the 7th generation. And it's not Columbus Day. Well, I wish that was so easy to repeal the national holiday. But even in Colorado in 2007, 2008, we tried to get the state legislature and the governor, because all three of those bodies, both the state senate, the state house, and the governor's office, were controlled by the Democrats. And we figured, oh, great. We now have some progressive thinkers, some progressive voices who will finally examine Columbus Day and say, enough is enough. We're now in the 21st century. And do we want to project different, more positive visions to our children, or the same old, worn-out racism of the past? And we went to the legislature, and we got State Senator Suzanne Williams, who's a Comanche woman, to draft the legislation. And when she tried to put forward the legislation, the Democratic leadership in both the House and the Senate refused to allow it to be introduced. They refused to allow hearings to take place. The governor said he would have vetoed Bill Ritter said he would have vetoed the legislation if it came to his desk. That's how progressive those Democrats were. And so, when it comes to Indians, and it comes to racism against Indians, some of these guys are still fighting the Indian wars. Some of them are still afraid that if they give 1 inch on these kinds of questions, oh, the whole country will revert back to Indian control, which we know is absurd. This is another chapter in this legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. So in 1980, the Supreme Court rules in U.S. Sioux Nation versus United States. They quote the Court of Claims in saying, this is one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history. A more ripe case of theft has never been found. But then they say, it actually wasn't before the court about whether to return the land or not. The way they've interpreted the Indian Claims Commission Act is that you can only pay for that land, even if the Indian people involved never sold the land, never said that they would accept money for the land. And so the Supreme Court affirmed the Indian Claims Commission award, but that money still sits in the U.S. Treasury because, to their credit, the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota nations have said those Black Hills are not for sale. And that money still sits in the U.S. Treasury because the Black Hills are not for sale. The question is, with the legacy of an ideology like Columbus and the erasure of our histories, how many generations will it be now before those young people say, hey, that's a lot of money. I think maybe I'd like my cut of that, because they've been so disconnected from their spiritual roots in the Chesapa, the Black Hills. That's what we're fighting against here, is that memory. The memory of that struggle, because it's not just the Black Hills. The Western Shoshone have a similar fight in Nevada. Over 24 million acres of territory that was never sold. That the Indian Claims Commission said, we'll give you $26 million for 24 million acres of your territory. The Western Shoshones never sold that territory. But again, the court upheld it, saying, Indian Claims Commission said, you lost your land. Somehow, magically, mysteriously. Partly through the operation of the Doctrine of Discovery. That you Indians have an inferior title here. You don't have a fee simple title. So those are the kinds of ideas that we're battling against. And this is the main thing. And this is what I hope that non-Indian people begin to assimilate and realize and help to decolonize their own minds. That I believe the reason that it was so difficult to try to repeal Columbus Day in its birthplace in Colorado was because most people realize, whether consciously or subconsciously, that they're beneficiaries of this theft. They have benefited from this theft. And they don't want to acknowledge that, and they don't want to compensate the original peoples for that. Maybe because they can't imagine how, without having to get back on the Mayflower.
Exactly.
But there are ways to achieve justice in the 21st century without... We know that people aren't getting back on the Mayflower. We know that people aren't leaving our homeland. But can we find some common ground of justice to deal with these issues once and for all? So our ancestors always said this place was big enough for us to share. But as Gandhi said, it's big enough for everybody's need, but not for everyone's greed. First of all, I think we have to repeal the doctrine of discovery. The notion that there was some legal, political, philosophical justification for going into somebody else's homeland, killing them, stealing their land, destroying their culture, that has to be repudiated. Has to be repudiated. They did it with Brown versus Board of Education. In 1954, they said that case of Plessy versus Ferguson that was decided in 1896, that said separate but equal was okay, it was not unconstitutional. 58 years later, they had to come back and say, we were wrong. We were wrong about that, and we reverse ourselves. Why can they not do that with Indians? You know why? Because it's about the land. Because they know, and you learn that in property law in law school. You learn that. They say, okay, this over here, your car, your stereo, your television, all this stuff, that's your personal property. But your land, that's your real property. Your real property is the land. And they understand that that's what this is about. This is not about allowing somebody to vote. This is not about allowing somebody to buy a house next to you. This is not about allowing the desegregation of a school classroom. This is about who controls the land, because they understand that land is power. Who controls the land has the power. Because they not only control the land, they control the resources under the land. That's what this is about. That's why we're out here on Columbus Day. This is about the doctrine of discovery that gives them the right, in their view, the legal right to the land and everything under the land, and everything that flows over the land, and everything that flies over the land. The air, the water, the oil, the gold, all of those resources, the timber, everything. That's what's at stake for them. And they have no spiritual connection to any of that. But the Supreme Court at some point has to revisit it and say this was wrong. And the point about this is that in the United States, they can sit on it for as long as they want to. But this impetus is already moving in the international arena. This year, we went to the United Nations, to the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And there was an agenda item talking expressly about the racism inherent in the doctrine of discovery, because it didn't stay in the United States. Once it was articulated in the United States, it got moved to Canada. And then it got moved to Australia and New Zealand and around the world. So other countries adopted it. They said, the United States, they came up with this great idea about how to dispossess the native people without even having to kill them. We'll just do it in the law. And so the United Nations has taken up this issue. And there was a report that was adopted by the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, calling expressly for the repudiation of the doctrine. And so there may have to be an International Court of Justice advisory opinion that the doctrine of discovery stands repudiated in international law, and then take that vehicle and go into national courts and try to force the national courts of these different countries that have benefited from it, and force them to look in the mirror and ask if they want to be in violation of the law of nations. Well, I'm here in part on behalf of Russell Means, and he always spoke about this prophecy that he was told when he was coming of age about a fire in the Americas that would begin in the South, move to the North, and they would unite. And in his view, that was about the reawakening of indigenous consciousness in the Americas. And now we see things like Peace and Dignity journeys that, but we see many other opportunities as well. We look at the example, for example, of Evo Morales being elected president of Bolivia. And for the first time in that country's history, or any country's history in the Americas, acknowledging and putting into law the rights of Mother Earth. That's about, and Russell often talks about Evo Morales perhaps being that fire that's starting in the South, and it's spreading and spreading and spreading. So it spreads to Peru. So in Peru, we see people in active struggle. And now the Supreme Court of Peru just said that they can protest and even blockade roads to prevent their lands from being destroyed by gold mining companies or oil companies. And so it's spreading to Ecuador, it's spreading to Brazil, it's spreading to Colombia, coming up the isthmus. And so I think Peace and Dignity Journeys is one of those threads. And there have to be multiple threads, but that's one of those powerful threads. And I have to give those guys credit, because they've continued that run year after year after year. And I honestly, personally, I didn't think that it was going to last. But they keep coming and they keep going. And I say, right on, more power to you. And I support that. And so whether it's that on a more micro level, where people are connecting spiritually to one another, community to community, that's really powerful. And then also these indigenous networks internationally, at the United Nations, at the World Intellectual Property Organization, at the Rio Plus 20 Summit, environmental summit that just happened in Brazil. People often have to develop parallel forums to the ones that the states produce. And in that way we empower ourselves, though. The Peace and Dignity Journeys run, they didn't get they didn't get money from the government. They didn't get money from Ford Foundation or any big funding agency. They did it out of grassroots support from community to community. Like coming here to Pueblo. You guys put them up. You fed them. You gave them forums. Literally. And so that's the way that's our tradition, though. And so one of the things that I wanted to come and talk to, and tomorrow night I'll be speaking at CSU Pueblo, about that alliance between Chicanos and Indians. The whole core of that was not to make that distinction anymore about mestizaje and indigenous values. That the whole Chicano struggle was about recognizing, acknowledging, respecting those indigenous values in our traditions. My mother's family is from Ireland, but my father taught me this is my homeland here, and so you got to make a choice. Is your allegiance to this place, to the land here, or to something else? And so in that alliance between say the American Indian Movement and the Crusade, or other organizations, that was at the core of that core understanding that we are one people. We might come from different labels or different memories, but the memory that unites us is the memory of our place on this land. That's what's going to endure. All these buildings here, Mitt Romney, all these politicians, all these Donald Trump, they're going to come and go. The land will endure. That's what our ancestors always taught us. The land will endure.
With or without us.
Right. And so if we are committed to the land will be committed to us. But if we abandon the land, then we're doomed. And that's what my brother Russell always says as well. He says, these environmentalists who say we're out to save the earth, how arrogant. Save the earth. We can't even save ourselves. We're not going to save the earth. The earth is going to be here. We might not be here as a species because we become so selfish, so self-absorbed, so short-sighted, and we forget the lessons of our ancestors. But the earth will survive. We have to decide whether we want to be here with the earth or not. Because the trajectory we're on, we won't be. And in my remarks today at the library, I mentioned this book by Wes Jackson called Becoming Native to This Place. Now, there are some Native people who are still not there yet. They say, no, that's not possible. But the question for us is, when we look back at the history of our ancestors, and our ancestors had people who showed up who were sincere about understanding how to listen to the earth, how to live in balance with the earth, our people took them in. Every one of our nations had ceremonies to make relatives who were not from our nation. Every one of our nations did, as far as I know. So there were always mechanisms for that. But there had to be reciprocity. There had to be a mutual understanding of what was required. And so that's part of the naturalization process. If you go anywhere in the world and you want to be a citizen of Canada, you want to be a citizen of Germany, and you're not born there, or you come to the United States, there's a naturalization process. Well, we had our own naturalization processes, but they're different than these countries. It had to do with your relationship to the earth. It had to do with speaking the language, which is the language that emanates from the earth. Our languages are connected to our relationship to every living thing. They're not abstractions like English. They are connected to our relationship with life. That's part of our naturalization. So if somebody is sincere about that, and they learn the language, and they learn our ceremonies, and they sincerely hold them, and then our nation's always made a place for them. And from the Pilgrims to Jamestown, all the way out here in the West, people showed up, they were taken in. They have a national holiday to Thanksgiving next month. And they forget that without those Wampanoags, those pilgrims would have starved to death.
What'd you call them?
The Wampanoags, the native people. Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that term.
Yeah, the Wampanoags. Those pilgrims would have starved. And so that's why we need archives like are being formed at CSU Pueblo, because when I go into my classes and I ask students, well, what do you know about the pilgrims? Well, they were fighting religious persecution and they came here for religious freedom and they did this and that. And I ask them, well, did you know that one of the ways they survived that first winter was that they robbed the graves of the Wampanoags? They took the funerary objects, the corn and everything that was buried to send those people on their journey. They stole that corn and that fish and they ate it themselves. Those pilgrims were grave robbers. Are they national heroes? But we don't have a perspective on history that way. And so history, let me say that fallacy then masquerades as history. You know? And that what they put out as history these days is actually a fallacious notion of what happened. The whole Columbus narrative is just bogus. If you look at his journals, he talks about Chipangu, which was at the time the Spanish name for Japan, not India. He thought he was going to meet the Great Khan, who was not in India but was in China, and that Chipangu was the islands for what we now consider Japan. And so Russell always is quick to point out, when he was in prison, an Italian scholar said, the word Indian does not come from Columbus's notion that he had been to India. It comes from Columbus's journal, in which he talks about una gente en Dios, a people in God. And Columbus, Las Casas, all kinds of writers during that period, they talk about the Taínos, the other Indian people in the Caribbean, as being the most loving, peaceful, generous people they had ever seen anywhere. They gave everything that they had, without limit, and they were generous to a fault. And so it doesn't push the limits of credibility to think that Columbus thought of them as being so generous that they were people in God, a people from God, a people in with God. And so, because if you look at many maps during that period, there was a word for India, but it was also just as common to find maps that called India Hindustan, not India. And so, anyway, that's a whole nother part of the historical record that is worth examining. Because this just very facile notion that the term Indian comes from the fact that Columbus thought he was in India diminishes those qualities of the indigenous peoples that the Europeans found so startling. The most generous they had ever encountered anywhere. And Las Casas wrote for 50 years about it. Said everywhere he went, Indian people were generous. They didn't have these notions of selfishness or private property. Eventually, people started resisting. That's the other fallacy about our history, is that, these Indians, I hear this all the time in my classes. There was a war. You guys lost. We won. Get over it. Well, that's not the way that it was. There were many, many wars of resistance. But they were not just dealing with the military arms of the Americans or the colonizers. They were also dealing with a mindset that they completely could not understand. A mindset that was so nefarious, they couldn't comprehend it. And so, for example, there's a book by this historian named Jill Lepore called The Name of War, where she talks about Metacom's War, King Philip's War in Connecticut in the 17th century. And she said the Narragansetts and the Pequots, they didn't understand a kind of warfare where you would kill women and children and old people. They said they just couldn't understand, they could not comprehend it. But when they saw the English doing that to their people, they started doing it to them. They said, okay, that's the way you want to play this? We can play it that way. We don't really get it. It's inhumane as far as we're concerned. And so that gets translated in a whole lot of different ways in terms of relationship to the land. So in Lakota, for example, that term Mitakuye Oyasin, we are all related. The notion that humans are related to this tree or this grass or those birds, in that Christian tradition that was being brought over here from Genesis 1:28, when Adam and Eve, God tells Adam and Eve, go forth, multiply, subdue the earth and the beasts of the earth, making human beings the boss of the whole world. Well, you can't have it both ways. You're either the boss of the world or you're related to everything in the world. But you can't have both. So something has to give. And that's really what the struggle is continuing today. Those worldviews. But now more and more people from the European tradition are saying, that boss model about humans having dominion over the earth and dominating the earth, that's not working so well. So we think we're moving over closer to this Indian side that says maybe we're related to everything. Maybe everything's connected. Even physicists, string theory or quantum mechanics in physics says everything is related. Everything is connected. Chaos theory in physics now recognizes what our ancestors have been saying for 500 years to these invaders. Everything is connected. If you exterminate this species over here, there's a consequence to it over here. Bartolomé de las Casas, he came as an encomendero. He came to get his stuff. He had an encomienda that had been parceled out for him, Indians enslaved to it. He came to get his stuff. But when he got here and he saw the brutality of the regime, that was the responsibility of Columbus, and Las Casas says this. He names the admiral in his writings, meaning Columbus. And even the most laudatory biographer of Columbus, Samuel Eliot Morison, in his book Admiral of the Ocean Sea, in chapter 35 of his book, it's called Hell in Hispaniola. Even Morison has to admit, he says, whoever thought up this ghastly system of encomienda, Columbus was responsible for it. And even Morison has to admit that what happened under Columbus and his brothers personally was a genocide. Morison uses the term, a genocide. And so if you read Las Casas, it's abundantly clear. Columbus was responsible. Columbus deserves no holidays. And when I talk to the African American community and I ask them, what do you think Columbus did before he came here? They say, we don't have any idea. Of course they don't, because that history's been sanitized. He was an African slave trader for the Portuguese. That's how slave trading came so easily to him when he tried to take slaves from the Americas back to Europe. He already knew how to do it because he was a slaver for the Portuguese. And he was bringing slaves from Guinea to Portugal. And so to say that Columbus was innocent but everybody else was guilty is ridiculous, and he deserves no holiday just for the African slave trade part of it. Let's say he didn't do anything else here. If he was an African slave trader, does he deserve a national holiday in the United States with the legacy of slavery that we have? But he didn't stop there, and he tried to enslave Indians. Then even Morrison admits that he engaged in a genocide. And if you read Las Casas, those accounts are horrible, horrific, where they took babies and they threw them in the air to see who could slice them in half with one stroke of their sword. The capital of Chiapas, San Cristobal de las Casas, is named after him. He was the first archbishop in Chiapas. But he traveled as far south as Venezuela, but he traveled throughout the Caribbean and Mexico and Central America. Then he went back. This is what makes Las Casas so credible and so important, because he didn't have to do any of that. He could have taken his encomienda, gotten rich, and just forgotten about the whole thing. But he didn't. He gave up his encomienda. He became a Dominican priest. In a very famous sermon by his mentor, Antonio de Montesinos, in 1511, they gave a sermon to Columbus's brother in Hispaniola. And they warned them. They said, you guys are going to hell for what you're doing to these Indians. So that also puts to the lie, it puts the lie to the notion that Columbus was just a man of his time. That's just what they did in 1492. Las Casas and Montesinos are living proof. That's not just what they did. There was opposition even to them in their own time. Not what Christian men do. That's what Montesinos said to them. You call yourselves Christians? You guys are going to hell for what you're doing here. So they tried to kill him. They actually did ultimately kill Montesinos because he went to the mainland as well. And they killed him there.
That was the mentor.
Right, the mentor.
The mentoree.
And so, but anyway, I encourage everybody to read Las Casas, because that's the other thing. Las Casas was the first European historian in the Americas. So all these people who say we're historical revisionists, that we're revising the historical record, they're revising the historical record. Las Casas was the first record. So anybody who tries to refute Las Casas is revising history. And Las Casas was there. He was an eyewitness. Plus, he's what in the law we call a witness against interest. That means that he had nothing to personally gain from doing this, and he had everything to lose, because there was this little thing going on in Spain called the Inquisition. And so he could be taken back to Spain because he was challenging both the church and the state, saying, what your guys are doing over here, the Franciscans, the conquistadores, they're in mortal sin. And so when he went back to Spain, he could have been taken before the Inquisition. But he didn't care. He wrote it all out. He wrote 50 years of history out and recounted massacre after massacre after massacre. In fact, the Las Casas estimate in the Caribbean was that 15 million Indians were killed. And these historians and demographers say, that's ridiculous. There weren't 15 million people in the Caribbean. How do they know? Las Casas was there. He was counting the bodies. It's just like the demography I was talking about earlier at the library. When I was a kid, they used to tell us there were only 1 million Indians in the United States in 1492. Then they had to keep revising it. Oh, maybe there were 2 million. Maybe there were 5 million. Maybe there were 10 million. Oh, now maybe there were 12 million. Okay, maybe there were 15 million. They see what they want to see in those graves that they rob. So that's what we're here for. That's what the Colombian legacy is refuting all those lies that deny us our humanity, our children their humanity, the earth, its life, all these species around us. That's the Colombian legacy. And if we don't stop it in Denver, if we don't stop it in Pueblo, if we don't stop it in Colorado, where will we stop it? This is the birthplace of it. We have an obligation, we have a responsibility to do something here. That's why we're out here. So the Doctrine of Discovery, which is not just a term of art, it's a legal doctrine that this country and Canada and Australia and New Zealand and every country around the world that oppresses native peoples uses to this day, but it started here. It started in this city. And we have an obligation, a responsibility to stop it in this city. So let's go over there and do that.
No more Columbus Day! 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 No more!
Sooner or later, that idea will overcome the poison that they bring to these celebrations. I just want to thank Rita, I want to thank Rudy, I want to thank all the people from this community for inviting us down. On behalf of the American Indian Movement of Colorado and Denver, we're always proud to come and stand shoulder to shoulder with you.